when I was in the lobby this morning. I really don't need to introduce Phillipa because so many people were coming up and saying how wonderful it was to see her again. But of course, I'm sure that she is a former MP. She is, I'm not quite certain whether she's retired as a surgeon or whether she's still working. In terms of currency, perhaps the most important thing is her work in Palestine. And I thought, what currency do they use in Palestine? Discovered the new Israeli shekel. If we're talking about imperialism, if we're talking about economic control, that fact alone tells us that we don't have justice in Palestine. Now, Phillipa has taken on the prospect of talking about a well-being economy. I will just, or well-being society. I will just say very briefly, here we are in Dunfermline. Tim mentioned Carnegie, and the leading thinking on well-being work in Britain is being undertaken at the moment by the Carnegie UK Trust. So there will be plenty of opportunity, I think, from what you're saying here, for it to have local resonance as well. So Phillipa, if you could speak, and then we'll take questions for both Colin, for both Colin and Phillipa at the end.
Thanks very much, Robbie. I'm definitely a former surgeon now. The hands get rusty. I'd like to thank Tim for inviting me to come and speak. And indeed for all of you at the Scottish Currency Group. Now, obviously, my title is the Wellbeing Economy, and naturally enough, as a surgeon for over 3 decades, I'm kind of on the well-being end of it. I leave the economic expertise to yourselves. Now, I often get asked to give talks on health. I'm wondering, could we put the lights down a wee bit here because they're reflecting off the screen, and obviously I need people to... Can you put them all off then? But I get asked to talk about health, but a bit like in 2014, what people mean is, could you actually come and talk about the NHS, the challenges it has faced since the pandemic, the challenges it faces because of Brexit and workforce loss. Workforce is the biggest single challenge to all 4 UK NHSs. And of course, the threat from Wes Streeting's privatisation agenda south of the border, and the fact that the Internal Market Act actually does give him powers to meddle in our health system for the first time. But that's not what I'm here to talk about, because I'm here to talk about health and well-being. And the NHS doesn't create health. It treats illness. We catch you when you fall. Sometimes we're lucky enough to cure you, but often we're helping you manage your illnesses. Whereas well-being is not even just about an absence of illness. It's a more holistic approach to the entire quality of life. It has 5 main pillars. Now, that includes physical and mental health, and the NHS may well play a key part in helping you to maintain those, particularly as you get older. But it also requires economic security, social inclusion, and environmental well-being. Now, that's not just saving the planet. That's, do you live in a warm, dry home? Are the streets around you safe to walk? Do you have access to green spaces? All of that is part of your environment. And it's only when we get that whole holistic system around every one of our citizens that we have a well-being economy. And therefore, most of that, housing, nutrition, clean air, access to nature, all of that's outside the NHS. And the NHS cannot patch up the deficiencies for people who don't have that. And what we now know is that a good start in life is vital. Now, that's not just infants. That's actually women before they become pregnant and whether they're in good health. It's actually also during pregnancy. We now know that the impact of the mother's health may influence your health in later life, your risk of heart disease, diabetes, and others. And we have to remember that if a woman is carrying a female child, that daughter's eggs are formed while she herself is in the womb. And therefore, if a pregnant woman is malnourished and stressed, she could be affecting 2 generations. She's affecting her grandchildren. That's how radical it is. And that's why the Scottish Government has such a focus, after the early years collaborative work by Harry Burns, such a focus on children and infants, on trying to give them a better start in life. Now, Scotland has quite a lot of universal benefits. The baby box, a great symbolism that we all start in the same place. And I actually love that there's a poem of welcome from the Macker in it. But it also includes about £400 of equipment that young parents would have to buy. So it's a great economic boost when you're suddenly faced with another mouth to feed and the need to buy all sorts of fancy gadgets and whatnot. Scotland also has over 1,000 hours of not just childcare, but early learning. Because it's that early learning side. It's not just about parking children somewhere, but it's giving them a positive experience very early in life, particularly for children from deprived backgrounds, where no one's reading them stories, no one's teaching them to sing songs. And by the time they get to school, often they're a year behind their peers. So it's this trying to really invest in the beginning. Scotland also has the most generous school meals programme up to primary 5. But obviously the aim is for all primary school children. And frankly, I think it should include all secondary school children. I think going out at lunchtime should be a privilege for 5th and 6th year, not first years who are all down playing chicken on the roads as they go down the chippy. That's what I would like to see. I would agree with Colin. We need more radicality, not less. But this is what we are doing for all of our children. But on top of that is the focused economic support of low-income families, the 3 Best Start grants, one of which is for pregnant women to try and ensure that they are having decent nutrition, but also in infant and early childhood. And of course, the Scottish Child Payment, which invests over £20,000 in every child from a low-income family, not just the first 2 per family, which is a complete piece of nonsense. But all of this work has contributed to, you may not be able to see it, but the turquoise line at the bottom is Scotland's child poverty rate. And we vie with Northern Ireland among nations and regions for who has the lowest child poverty. Scotland's the only nation predicted to reduce child poverty in the coming 5 years. But we're still talking more than 1 in 5 children. That is way too high. Now, it's much higher than the Scottish Government set their target for, but literally since 2010, they have been swimming against the tide of austerity, and particularly since 2017, the impact of the 2-child cap, which is the biggest single issue driving children into poverty. And it's that problem that we have. And yet here we are, we're over a year into a supposedly Labour government. Now, they lost me when they invaded Iraq, but I don't even recognize them now as anything like a Labour Party. And they're still keeping the 2-child limit, which is absolutely shocking. And the Scottish wellbeing policies are not just for children. They actually run throughout the entire life course. So if we only talk about the Scottish Child Payment, there'll be lots of people in Scotland think, well, I don't get anything from that. But when you start to talk about all of Scotland's unique policies, you realise whatever age you and your family and your parents and your children are, there'll be people who are benefiting from this well-being approach that we have. Our young people get to go to college or university without paying tuition fees. Now, I'm lucky enough, and many in this room are lucky enough, that we came from that era. My stepfather threw me out the house when I was in first year. I would never have been a surgeon if I had faced university fees. And it's okay, people could have said, don't worry, you can have a loan. You'll be a doctor. You'll be able to pay it off. But right now, kids south of the border will have £100,000 in debt if they study medicine. Do you think a 19-year-old or 18-year-old on their own in the world is going to sign up for that? No. So this is something that allows our young people to reach their full potential. Working age people and families, their biggest outlay is on housing, whether it is mortgages or rent. And despite what you see in the media or among opposition MPs, Scotland has built the most affordable homes per capita in the last 15 years, 47% more than what was Tory-run England, 73% more than Labour-run Wales. But it's not enough, because we don't control our capital, we don't have borrowing powers. Investing in infrastructure, whether it's public infrastructure or infrastructure for our citizens, we are always limited by not controlling our own budget and not having borrowing powers. Of course, we have other things like free prescriptions and free dental checks, eye checks, that are also unique to Scotland. And the British Asthma Society do surveys every year or so, which show that south of the border, 1/3 of medication will not be collected because people can't afford the prescription charges. That means people's disease gets out of control. They're more likely to end up in hospital as an emergency. That's a very expensive way to manage people's health. And of course, our older citizens do benefit from free personal care and nursing care that allows them to maintain some dignity and independence in their own homes. And getting the bus pass at 60 rather than 67 lets them actually get out of their own homes and engage in society. I would agree with Colin that we need a national care service. I just do not agree that it should be freestanding from the NHS. We need what Northern Ireland calls a health and care service, because Scotland has led on the integration agenda, which has made a huge difference. So why now split it at the cost of 9 billion into two separate things? Health and care are basically either ends of the same stream. And I would like to see it being built from the grassroots up. And there's plenty of things within the care sector that need reformed. In Ayrshire, the 3 councils have totally different levels of people who are trapped in hospital waiting for care. And it's East Ayrshire that has taken social care and care homes back into public control that is the one that's doing the best. So there's lots of lessons to be learnt in that, but I don't support setting up something separate, and then we still argue about whose budget should fund Mrs. McGlinchey's care. Let's keep it together. Yeah. And the problem is that all of this is great that our Scottish government has a well-being approach, but everything we do is just mitigation. It's a sticking plaster. It doesn't tackle the real problem, which is our current underlying economic model. It's one that's based on quantity, not quality. It's one that tries to reduce the value and worth of a nation to a single digit. It's based on profit, even if that involves exploitation of people and planet. And the current obsession with GDP growth every quarter of every year is based on endless consumption. Do we really not know that resources are limited? That we're going to eat the planet or burn the planet? And of course, this drives inherent inequality, the exploiter versus the exploited. And as Colin mentioned, the financialization that's been happening since the 80s of public assets like energy, like oil and gas, that were just largely handed over to private companies to exploit. And of course, this is going to happen all over again, is already happening with green energy, but also of our public services. And of course, PFI is the prime example of that. And this focus on profit over everything else drives what's called failure demand. That if you don't get it right first time, it costs you more to remediate it. Consider doing your own bit of really shabby DIY and then having to get in a professional. That always works out more expensive. And governments end up picking up the tab. So this is a very pointless thing to do, but that's the direction that our economy is pushed by, this obsession on GDP, on growth, and particularly on profit. Profit is king over everything else, regardless of the human cost or planetary cost. So the profit of a company cleaning up an oil spill will be counted in GDP. But protecting the environment from that in the first place, that doesn't score any points. Big pharma profits are particularly valued and lauded within GDP, but good public health and prevention of illness, I mean, we all know the saying, prevention is better than cure, but it doesn't count in GDP. So the profit, even from industries that normal citizens consider somewhat negatively, such as smoking, gambling, alcohol, particularly at the moment, the arms trade, all of these are given a great thumbs up in GDP. But GDP doesn't consider what we as citizens value, such as health, education, culture, nature. It doesn't measure wealth distribution. Even if you have GDP per head, that's still just national GDP divided by population. And it's driven by and dragged up by the number of billionaires at the top. It doesn't tell you anything about ordinary people. And we know that the UK is the 6th most unequal developed nation and the 2nd most unequal in the G7, behind only the US. And what we've seen since the 2008 crash is the wealthy have trebled their wealth in that time. So much for George Osborne's "We're all in it together." Meanwhile, the poor, but also just ordinary staff and workers, have become poorer over the last 17 years. And that was driven by austerity. And of course, here we are into austerity 2.0 under Labour. And all of that austerity drives poverty, which is utterly corrosive. We know that young people who might grow up in real poverty and deprivation may be tempted to shoplift. We hear that, mothers stealing baby formula at the moment. But even if they don't get sucked into that, even if they don't get sucked into a drug gang like County Lines, they are surrounded by crime. The graph on the left, which is looking at exposure to crime, and in all the graphs I'll show you, on the left-hand end is the most deprived communities, right-hand end is the wealthiest. Now, it's all sorts of crime. It doesn't matter. But even if they don't get sucked in, they can be victims. They are surrounded by it. They are exposed to it. And on the right is, of course, that chestnut, the educational attainment gap, which is always focused on here in Scotland. How come the Scottish Government have not closed the attainment gap? Here's the attainment gap from the 22 data for England at GCSEs, and the children, the pupils, who have achieved 5 good GCSEs. On the left, from a deprived or low-income background, only a quarter of them will get 5 GCSEs. Those from wealthy families, over 70%. That's a 45 percentage point attainment gap. Have you ever heard of it on UK media? Not a whisper. And yet National Fives, which is the same equivalent as GCSE, the attainment gap has narrowed from over 30% to approximately 15 percentage points. That's halved. At the higher level, it's down by 2/3. So Scotland has massively managed to reduce the attainment gap, not close it, but reduce it. And what none of us should forget is it's not an education gap. As I say, by the time these children hit primary school, it's a struggle for teachers to actually redress that balance. This is a poverty gap. And that's what we need to be tackling. And poverty is also the biggest single driver of ill health. Professor Michael Marmot, who did his famous review in 2010, repeated it in 2020, in his second review, found that healthy life expectancy, i.e. how old you get before you start crumbling and collecting various chronic illnesses like badges or trump cards, that was falling. And what you see here, what he also found was life expectancy itself was falling for the first time since the Second World War, particularly among women in low-income and deprived communities in the north of England. Now, obviously, the black line is when you pop your clogs. Again, on the left, most deprived, on the right, wealthiest. And you can see the gradient of the black line. But if you look at the green line, which is healthy life expectancy, you see it's even steeper. It's even more dramatic. And that means people from a deprived background or low-income background could spend 1/3 of their life in ill health. Of course, that has a massive impact on their quality of life, but it also puts the NHS under huge pressure. And poverty kills. It's as simple as that, both young and old. When I was vice chair of the Health in All Policies cross-party group at Westminster, we did an inquiry back in 2015 and 16 to look at what the likely impact of the 2016 benefit cuts was going to be. And I remember a professor of public health coming out with a figure that the UK loses 1,400 children a year before their 15th birthday. They die as a direct result of poverty. That figure has never left me. The causes of death are multiple and various, but all of these are strongly associated with poverty. Now, that is a secondary school. Surely if the roof of a secondary school was collapsing every single year and killing that many pupils, wouldn't we be doing something about it? Wouldn't we be revising building standards? Would we really just let it go on and let all that young life and potential be wasted? That's hard to believe. And yet, he's the only person I ever heard talk about it. Obviously, I raised it in the House of Commons, but I mean, that was deaf ears. And of course, the Glasgow Centre for Population Health looked specifically at austerity between 2012 and 2019, so before the pandemic, and found over 330,000 excess deaths as a direct result of austerity. And the thing that is most annoying is austerity doesn't work. When George Osborne was promising us, when we all arrived in the tsunami or the jocalypse, as we were called in 2015, that, oh, he would get rid of the deficit, get rid of the debt, just by cutting back on benefits. It doesn't work. Because if you cut benefits and freeze public sector pay, all you do is take money out of local economies. You end up with dead high streets. People can't afford to go out and buy new clothes or go for a meal. So local employers employ fewer people. Further down back the supply chain, factories don't need so many people because no one's buying the goods. So eventually what you end up with is a decreased tax take to the Treasury. It all comes home to roost. And what is the excuse that's often given for why we need to have more austerity? Exactly as Rachel Reeves talks about at the moment. So that we can give tax cuts to the wealthy. Now, surely everybody knows it doesn't trickle down. It just goes offshore. What you need is a trickle-up economy where you are planting and irrigating the economy at the bottom of the pyramid, making sure your citizens live well and can engage in your economy and in your society. And of course, it just creates more failure demand, more pressure on public services, whether that's the DWP or local addiction services or your NHS. And the cost of blighted lives of young people who grow up in poverty and deprivation, who struggle at school because they're cold and hungry. I co-chaired the Children's Future Food Project at Westminster. And I wasn't wearing glasses all the time then, but I had to put them on to hide that I was crying, listening to the evidence given by the young ambassadors, of having headaches because they couldn't afford to buy a bottle of water, of struggling with maths, which was just before lunch because they hadn't eaten since the evening before. I mean, for goodness sake, the UK boasts about the size of its economy, and yet you have children who are struggling with education because of the basics of enough food and drink and living in a warm home. And whether it's unemployment or addiction or ending up in the criminal justice system, governments pick up the pieces later. This is failure demand. Why not invest in the children in the first place? And of course, the ultimate failure demand is climate change. We still have people who somehow think this is a problem for the end of the century. And yet we all know the climate crisis is happening now. Wildfires, droughts, floods, landslides, including here in Scotland, where we've had multiple wildfires over the last 2 years. And yet the Tories were merrily handing out new oil licenses. Labour pooled their commitment of 28 billion a year to green industry, even though that was still less than France, Germany, and Italy are investing every year. So the UK is going to fall further behind, exactly as Colin was talking about, in transforming their economy. And of course, Farage's reforms say that they're just going to abandon net zero altogether, with no consideration of the cost of not zero. If sea levels rise and capital cities like London start to become flooded, how on earth do you think you'll manage that? How much will that cost? So there's an urgent need for change to a different kind of economy that isn't based on endless consumption of limited resources. And so the well-being economy is one that focuses on well-being and sustainability, on investment in people and protection of the planet, so that individuals can reach their full potential, can have good health, and therefore they can contribute to society and indeed to the economy itself. Now, in 2017, the Scottish Government had the Inclusive Growth project, and that was still very much about economic growth, but there was the recognition that people never benefited from that. They were shut out. If it was women, they needed more childcare, and that's what led to the doubling of the hours of early learning and childcare. And Scotland has the highest rate of women engaged in the workforce. But it was also transport, to let people get to a job if it's a physical job. Now, again, all we ever hear in the media here is the A9 or ferries. But there's been huge infrastructure builds in Scotland related to transport, whether it's the completion of the M8, the M74 orbital, the Aberdeen bypass, the Helensburgh to Bathgate line, the Borders Railway, or the Queensferry crossing that I came over this morning. All of those are massive in a short period of time, and many of them were being discussed way back in the 80s, and it took decades for them to come to fruition. Of course there's more to be done, but again we come back to Scotland does not control its capital budget, nor can it borrow, whereas any sensible country that is independent is able to borrow to invest, and that is critical. And at a conference on this topic in 2018, the Scottish Government founded the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group with Iceland and New Zealand, and some other countries have joined. We're also part of what's called the Wellbeing Alliance, which is academics across the globe studying policies that can really make a difference to the health and well-being of citizens and therefore contribute to the well-being economy. And we all need to realize that what we've been fed for the last 40-odd years is nonsense. The economy is not a deity, a golden calf, or an immutable law of physics. It can be changed, but you need power to change it. And that's why we need Scottish independence. Yes, we can patch things up and try and look after our citizens, but you need to tackle the underlying issue. We don't even get to control our own natural resources. So, I mean, how unindependent can we possibly be? Even though Scotland has huge resources for renewable electricity and energy, our consumers face the highest charges in the UK, standing charges in the Highlands that are 50% higher than in London. But at the other end of the supply chain, our generators also pay 10 to 15 times the charge to put electricity into the national grid. To go where? To go south. And of course, we all know that GB Energy is just, well, it's not a farce, actually, it's a threat. Because never mind how many jobs there are in Aberdeen, that is completely irrelevant, even if there were 1,000, even in a big shiny headquarters. GB Energy is about taking Scottish energy resources south for no return to a Scottish government or to Scottish citizens. And if you look on the left, I hope you can see it from the back, in 2021, Scotland and the north of England were net exporters of electricity to the Midlands and the south. But if you look at the right-hand map, which is the end of this decade, what you see is Scotland turned into a huge power station to supply England. And yet we don't get any return on that. So we will be covered by windmills and power lines and pylons simply to export electricity south, with no voice in that, no ability to make sure that the return is to Scotland. And as Colin said, we missed out on the sovereign wealth fund from oil. We're in danger that we're going to miss out on a sovereign wealth fund from green energy. And of course, now what do we have? A nuclear tax, and even Ed Miliband demanding that they start looking for sites in Scotland that could have nuclear power stations that we don't want. We don't want Trident, but we don't want bloody nuclear power either. But we need the full powers of independence. And obviously that's the theme of this weekend. So we need the political, fiscal, and monetary powers. The ability to choose whether to go back into the EU, to deal with the red tape that our exporting businesses face, and also to tackle the cost of living crisis, where we've seen food prices go up. We import 40% of our food from Europe. So the red tape affects our food costs here. And also the social impact of losing freedom of movement, both to attract people in and for our young people to have literally been able to live, work, study, settle in any one of 31 countries. The ability to set macroeconomic policy. And of course, what you're going to be talking about, the need for our own currency and our own central bank. Now that's to give security to retail banks, but also to support a future Scottish government in a time of crisis, like we saw in 2008 or during COVID. Just press a button. If you've got your own currency and your own central bank, yeah, we'll just print some more. We don't even bother to print it. It's just digital. And then we can wind it back in if we want to later on. But for that, you need your own currency. But it's also to not have someone else setting our interest rates for our mortgage holders. And very importantly, to escape the City of London and the financialisation that, whether in Scotland or England, all drags wealth from public assets and public services into business in London. And so the well-being economy for an independent Scotland would give us the power to directly improve people's lives, setting a real living wage as a minimum. And then you don't need to actually be having so much in-work benefits. We, the taxpayer, yes, we're supporting people who are in in-work poverty, but in actual fact, we're paying the wage bill for companies who won't pay their own wage bill. Having a living pension closer to the EU norm, where it's 70 to 90% of average earnings, would help tackle pensioner poverty, as opposed to the paltry 29% of average earnings that is the very mean UK pension. We could experiment in streamlining financial support for citizens through universal basic income or minimum income guarantee. When the Scottish Government wanted to set up 4 pilot sites, while I was still an MP, the DWP just said, if you give them extra money, we'll just cut their benefits. And therefore it couldn't go ahead. So we couldn't even do a pilot scheme in Scotland, whether you were looking at low-level universal basic income or higher level. We would be able to explore that as other countries have done. And of course, power over immigration. Scotland's sitting on a demographic time bomb. Colin mentioned the number of centenarians, but we also have far more deaths than births. At some point, we won't have a big enough working age population to support everybody else. Power over taxation. Instead of just the blunt instrument as income tax, suddenly you have the whole array of business and wealth taxes at your disposal. And of course, we would finally be able to have a Scottish energy generation company. What was aspired to in 2017 was a supply company. And the Scottish Parliament did look into it, but they discovered that the profit margins were tiny and the sector was overcrowded. And thank goodness they didn't go ahead, because you remember the number that collapsed in 2022. The power and the money is in generation. And that is strictly forbidden in the 1998 Devolution Act. But in the meantime, we need to be radical, looking at local government and municipal energy projects, like we're seeing in Orkney at the moment with their own wind farms. If we can't get through in the short term, we have to go round. And finally, the central role of the well-being economy in the independence debate. Now, independence by itself won't change anything. There isn't an independence fairy. And as Colin said, nothing changes on day one. There'll be a lot of hard work. But we would be the generation to get up off our bahookies, roll up our sleeves and get to it. I think that would be incredibly empowering. It gives us the power to tackle our problems, such as poverty and inequality, to utilize our incredible national natural resources like energy, like water, like land, for the benefit of the people who live here, but also to choose our own future path, whether that's back to the EU or to be a voice for peace and reason internationally. When I lived in Gaza in the early 90s, it was Norway that was leading the peace project. And we've seen other Nordic nations step up at different times. Scotland could be exactly that kind of voice. But we have to recognise something that we claim all the time. The people of Scotland are sovereign. Well, so if we believe that, we have to respect it. Scotland will not become independent until a majority of people who live here actually want it. And therefore, we need to get back to the why of independence. Stop bickering with each other. Come back together as a movement and be reaching out to other people. Lots of folks say, we need a vision of an independent Scotland. Well, to me, a well-being economy is the positive vision of an independent Scotland for ordinary citizens. And all of us should get out there and tell them about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phillipa. I can already see one question. So I will avoid the temptation. If Colin can join as well, that would be really good. I can see one question. It's almost like Prime Minister's questions when people rush towards the exits. But Chris, if you could go, and then this gentleman here.
Maybe if people could say who
Hello?
the question is to.
That's me.
Can
Yeah.
you say who the question
Yeah, well, I'm
is to?
Chris Hanlon. I've actually got a question for each of you, so
Oh, now, dinna hog the time.
I'll
It's a
try my
long
best.
day.
I'll be quick. Colin, you said some really interesting stuff, particularly about persuading the electorate, and then following on from that about having a mandate for what you want to do with independence and actually needing to have something radical to actually win that independence, let alone have a mandate to implement it afterwards. So I wondered if you could maybe explore the thinking perhaps of not just try to persuade the people, but try to persuade the leadership of the SNP and the next generation of leadership of the SNP to have more radical ideas, to have the courage and the self-belief to put them forward. Phillipa, you just put up a list of policies that you think are really important for well-being, and I know it's one crucial thing missing from that list. Now, I think many of us here are adherents of what you might call the emerging post-neoliberal heterodox economic tradition of, credible economists like Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Rayworth, Stephanie Kelton, Pavlina Chernova, and if there would be one policy that group of economists would be putting forward, it would be a job guarantee, which is pretty much universal amongst that group of economists, and it's SNP policy. So, why is it missing? Why is it not up there? Why are we not hearing about it?
Because it's not currently active. We're not delivering a job guarantee. And frankly, I was told I had 30 minutes. If you want me to list every single wellbeing policy that we already have, that would be 3 slides. So that's why it's not there. We aren't able to guarantee a job for everyone. Lots of us will know young people, including graduates, who did what we told them, worked hard at school, worked out at uni, are now graduates and are just always told, you've got no experience. No? So jobs, particularly for young people, if we did well at uni, you got a job. That's not the case for young people at the moment. So how could I claim the benefit or look at the well-being benefit of a job guarantee? We don't have that at the moment.
This is a government job guarantee. This is the policy of a government job guarantee. I'm just confirming that's where it is. I don't think it's a government job guarantee.
Would you like Colin to speak?
Yeah, can I just say, the question was how do I persuade the leadership of the SNP to be more radical? I would put on record, I have a good relationship with the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon and I sat together in the Justice Committee for 4 years. Nicola was on the advisory board. I'm able to speak to John Swinney. The lines of communication are there. I respect their point of view. Politics is often about differences of opinion, and Phillipa was identifying, for example, in the National Care Services about how you get it and how you run it. They're perfectly legitimate, and I would hope those debates are done in a collegiate kind of way. We're all pointing the same direction. In a funny sense, the whole raison d'etre of the SNP is to put pressure on the leadership of the SNP on questions of independence and related matters. And to give you a couple of examples very briefly, I put forward the bill in the Scottish Parliament to abolish prescription charges in Scotland. I watched Phillipa's slides and I was reminded it was the Scottish Socialist Party bill that was introduced. When I was there, the SNP supported it and the Greens supported it, but Labour and the Liberals and the Tories voted it down. But the idea, I was celebrating, as you might imagine, as much as anybody when the SNP government administration next picked it up and implemented it. I think that's the right thing to do. And I'd like to say, albeit humbly, the role the Scottish Socialist Party played in that was positive, it was constructive, it helps focus the debate. And the other thing I think is possibly even less remembered, the Scottish Socialist Party put forward the bill to abolish pindons and warrant sales, 1999, with Alec Neil's co-sponsorship and Dennis Canvan and John McCallion, if you remember. And although the poll tax is a long time ago, those of us who were in the poll tax know what an absolutely poisonous bill that was, and the way it alienated communities in South Ayrshire and Lanarkshire and the rest of it. So that abolition, again, collectively, we achieved it. So I suppose, in a sense, it's the SNP's business. I suspect most parties, including the Scottish Socialist Party, our policies are shaped by the electorate, you know. We put things out there and the electorate go, don't like that much. And so you back off from it, especially if you're standing in an election. Elections is a bit of a, you know, it's a, what would you say, it's a complex where sometimes people don't like what you offer, in which case you play that down as much as you can. And other things that you do that they like, you try and appeal to them in that sense. So that's what all the parties are doing. I suspect that's what the SNP will do too. I think these conferences are really, really important because we are extraordinary people here. This isn't the electorate of Scotland. We're people who are given, we're fortunate to have time and the opportunity to think about these things in detail and discuss them with one another from time to time. That the electorate as a whole, too busy putting the kids to bed, too busy with 3 hours, you know, 3 different jobs, etc. So the corollary is that because we are given that time, we've got to use that time wisely and discuss in a constructive way to solve the problems of an ageing population, a falling population. And in Scotland, I think the independence movement, lots of things to be proud of. We've established the tone that's set in this country on immigration, for example. It's totally different south of the border. People are worried about rubber boats. We're more concerned about a population that's declining. People are not coming here. A population that needs to have people coming here to bring their talents and abilities. And I think the independence movement's entitled to take a great deal of credit for the tone and the atmosphere the debate takes place on that issue in this country.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. I did see one hand up there, and I see another one just in front. So maybe you could just pass the microphone forward when you're finished.
Thanks. My name's Norman Easton. Can you hear me? Yes?
No, you need to hold it right at your
Sorry.
mouth.
My name's Norman Easton. I was at last year's conference as well, although I didn't really contribute much. There's 2 questions I want to put. I'm not actually sure whether they're not both for each of you. But the first point I would say is the need to be bold. I think you were hinting at that, though you didn't quite use that language, Colin. I'm haunted by 2014, in particular the second debate on the currency, where I remember being at the back of the Oran Moor in Glasgow with a big screen watching. And it was just disastrous because I think we all knew the first debate, it was a walkover. And it was a walkover because, not because there wasn't a plan B, it's because there wasn't actually a plan A. And what we're doing here is this is the plan A, right? We're creating the plan A. I don't think we need a plan B if we've got a credible plan A. The central mistake was thinking that the model in my mind right away was, it's as if the Scottish Government and the Yes movement, with the exception of Dennis Canavan, who was always in favour of Scottish currency, handed a loaded pistol to Alistair Darling by the barrel and challenged him to shoot. And he did. And that was the finish of it. So my question is, would you agree that that is a central hole in the message the last time? When what's-his-name came up with the Project Fear, that was where a major part of the fear was. These guys don't know what the currency is going to be. They don't know how the economy is going to be run. So why did we vote for them? I'll leave it there.
Okay, perhaps we could take the other question as well just now.
Yes, my name's Vicky Gardner from Perth Yes Hub. My question is about assets, which you've both covered in some ways, in the sense of most of the benefit of our assets appears to be going elsewhere. We also know that our land is primarily owned, not necessarily by the people, well, certainly not by the people of Scotland, but of those that are owned by the people of Scotland, it's a very tiny amount. How we also then have a situation where, when we are independent, we have to maintain confidence for people to invest in Scotland. On the one hand, we could actually say we can take back our assets, but that means that those people who have assets in Scotland might be saying, you don't dare invest in Scotland, because actually, if they don't like what you're doing, they'll actually, sequester your assets, for instance. How do you both view A, that as a proposition, and B, how one might tackle that so that we can give people confidence to invest in Scotland, give ourselves confidence to invest in Scotland, but at the same time make things more equal so that it's all benefiting us?
You go first, he says.
He's just going to storm the barricades and grab it.
The famous Scottish explorer who was cowardly. You go first.
Don't you call me a
coward? No, just that. I love that joke. Two things I was going to say. One to Norman. Bold, yeah. Actually, I don't know if you believe this or not, but boldness is not something I'm usually accused of lacking. Usually the Scottish Socialist Party is seen as extreme and too bold and too audacious and out of touch and too impatient for change, etc. So, but to get to your question, here's something I wanted to tell you on the currency. I was on the Yes Scotland Advisory Board. I enjoyed my time there. I thought it was a success. I thought it was a terrific organisation to be part of. The Scottish Socialist Party's representative on it was me, there was Nicola, there was Dennis, there was Pat Kane, there was Elaine C. Smith, there was people for business, etc. A lot of people I got to meet for the first time, and they're still friends of mine. If I look back in the advisory board time I was there, I've only one regret, and that's that we came to a meeting after. You mentioned George Osborne when he came to that hotel in Edinburgh and say you can't have the pound, remember? And nonsense. We had an advisory board, I think, with a couple of days of that. And I remember myself and Dennis, Patrick Harvey, Pat Kane, etc. It was clear the consensus of the meeting is we have to deal with this issue, we have to deal with it straight on, and we have to answer point blank, we need our own currency. The answer here is our own currency, not beholden to London, certainly not for the sterling, certainly not for the euro. We needed our own currency. And it was obvious at that meeting, which were largely done by consensus, to be fair, all the meetings were consensus, obvious there was a majority of people of that point of view. I think if my memory serves me right, Nicola wasn't at the meeting, but there was other representatives for the SNP there. And I remember Blair Jenkins, who wasn't keen that we should issue a statement saying the advisory board wanted to say, we want a currency, that's the way we deal with this, a clear, straight answer. You know, there's pluses and minuses. I'm sure you've discussed it many times, and you'll discuss it again this weekend. There are consequences, there are responsibilities. The choices are complex, all of them. But weighing up all the complexities, pluses and minuses on all sides, my view is that the currency, our own currency, is the best of the options available to us. I briefly reiterated that at the meeting. And what happened at the meeting was, I think there was a feeling, I was of the view we should put it to a vote, or we should press the issue and say we need to resolve this, and the best time to do it is now. Osborne's just been here, etc. We didn't. And the reason we didn't is Blair offered us the view, or he suggested, the SNP have done internal polling in this matter that I'll get to you by the next meeting that shows this is going to lose its support if we argue that for our own currency. It will be detrimental to the big prize. And remember, the big prize was everything we considered. We wanted to win a majority. I think in hindsight, if I had my chance again, I would have insisted that we press that button and say, well, that might be the case, even though we never seen the polling evidence, etc., still never seen it. That might be the case, but this is an issue that we need to address, and we never did. How we do that, really that's the important of a conference like this. This issue has to be taken further. You've done some terrific work. I've got my money. I'll be taking this money to next week's Scottish Socialist Party conference and see if I can get tea and coffee there. There's a lot more work to be done. Of course it is, and not least of it all is taken into the schemes where the more, huge proportion of our potential support remains to be won over. But I don't balk at the issue. People go to Mallorca on their holidays with their euros. They go to America with their dollars, or Canadian dollars, Australian pounds, etc. It's not beyond us, We can deal with this. We can persuade people. So I hope that answers the question. To answer Vicky, wasn't it? Vicky's question about assets and liabilities. This is really important, and I think the Scottish Socialist Party in 30 years has still got a pretty immature attitude towards investments and capitalists and people who are trying to make profit and things like that. So we're coming to terms with the fact that investment is welcome. The people who have the investment tend to have A, a lot of money to invest, B, they're looking for a rate of return on their investment and security in their investment, isn't it? Now, there's a debate, I'm sure everybody here is aware of it, about a wealth tax. Should we have a wealth tax? The Greens are for wealth tax, etc. I have to say, I put in front of you, I was a chartered accountant. Chartered accountancy drove me to Trotskyism. I hope you got that in camera, because chartered accountants exist essentially to avoid the rich paying taxes. That's what I did in my chartered accountant's life. I wasn't happy with it. I gave it up and became a full-time socialist revolutionary. Far happier, although substantially poorer. The point I'm making is that a wealth tax for me is only going to get you coppers. If we consider the North Sea, the British government taxed the profits of the oil companies in the North Sea, but it was no substitute for owning the industry. Absolutely. It was no substitute for owning all the profits. And in the same regard, I'm a socialist who's in favour of public ownership. Public ownership is far more of a redistributive measure than a wealth tax would ever be. You own the whole company. You take the wealth that's generated by that industry or corporation and you put all the profits at the disposal of that board or that intergovernmental body, whatever it is, and you deploy it. I'm in favour of public ownership. I want to see a bigger part of the economy directed by, ultimately, the bottom line, the profits go to build council houses, schools, social care, etc. That's really important to me. But I do recognise that in the real world of today, which Vicky's question is about, those who want to invest here, we need to encourage them. And we need to encourage them on the basis of what the investment is going to be used for, morally, socially, as well as just economically, and the bottom line. And that's a project that we've all got to participate in.
I mean, I think just to pick up what Norman is saying, the mere fact that we're both here shows that we are committed to a Scottish currency. I agreed with that in the first place. I did come across, because I was very active in 2014, doing lots of public meetings, and there was a fear among ordinary people of, if we don't have the pound, my mortgage changes, my pension changes. And I think that was absolutely the reasoning behind don't scare the horses. What I felt, being Irish, where they had become independent, they had sterlingization, they had their own currency, they went to the EU. When I was previously in Belfast, you had big shops took the pound, the punt, and the euro all at the one time. Because so what? We now all just use our phones. It isn't an issue. But I think that don't scare the horses. And the other side of it was to remove 10% of the sterling zone would have been a huge issue for the UK government. So in actual fact, Alec just never believed they would want to do that. That's why he was so content to go with the we'll keep the pound. The idea that Osborne turned around and said, no, you won't. I think that caught Alec completely off balance. But I, for all the reasons that we've talked about, believe that we should have our own currency, regardless of whether that took you a few steps to get to it or you had it on day one of independence. That should be where you're going. from the point of view of Vicky, obviously coming back to being Irish, from land, they just took it. They took it and they divvied it up, and everyone got a cottage, a bit of peat to harvest turfs from, a wee bit of ground to have someone on. If you drive through Ireland, instead of the cleared Scotland where everyone's in villages, you will see literally a house on every wee hill. Now, some of them look like Spanish haciendas. The planning control must be horrific, but that's what they did. I would agree. I mean, we keep lauding foreign direct investment and, oh, we're the highest FDI outside London. Yeah, that's fine. You're bringing money in, but where does the profit go to in the end? We should be trying to attract Scottish investment. And the problem is we have people who set up companies, they get all that assistance at the beginning, and as soon as it's worth a lot, they decide they'll flog it when they're 40 and retire as a millionaire. How do we change that mindset? How can we invest in things like government bonds, Scottish government bonds, so that we start buying into? Statoil, or Equinor as it is now, doesn't completely own the Norwegian oil company. They own the golden share. They own 51%. Now, what you could be saying is these companies that have been exploiting our assets, you can set that you're going to do that gradually. Not necessarily on day one that you take everything away, but you start taking government shares, and therefore you're at least getting profit. And as it's growing, you're saying, well, we now can borrow, and we can borrow much cheaper than you can borrow. So we're going to start investing and gradually taking a bigger share in our assets. I think that the idea that on day one, everything that everybody owns is taken away, I would agree that would more than scare the horses. But our aspiration has to be that services, now I don't have an issue with there being private companies, but my water, my electricity, my transport, my health, my care, all of those should be provided by the state, so that no matter where in Scotland I live, I can count on getting clean water. Because I can vouch with 9 years in Westminster, a cup of tea made in a flat in London is disgusting. So these are the things, but we need to prepare to be doing it gradually and with some degree of justice to people who did invest. But it is something a Scottish government could do over time.